Everyone starts the story at Damascus. The light, the fall, the voice, that's where every preacher begins. That's where every documentary begins. That's where every Bible study begins. And that's exactly why no one has ever seen what actually happened to Paul. Because Damascus wasn't the beginning. Damascus was the end. The end of something that had been running silently, without witnesses, without a name, without anyone noticing, for a long time before that road. And here is the question that will reframe everything you think you know. What if Paul didn't change at Damascus? What if Paul had already been changing, and Damascus was just the moment he could no longer pretend he wasn't? Look at the behavior, not the theology, not the doctrine, the behavior. Paul didn't wait for orders. He requested authorization himself. He didn't stay local. He traveled to foreign cities on his own initiative. He didn't delegate. He went personally. No institution demanded that level of urgency. No external pressure created that acceleration. Something internal was driving him. Something that couldn't slow down. Something that needed this to end fast. And here is where the story stops being familiar. Paul was one of the most sophisticated legal and theological minds of his generation. He had the training, he had the platform, he had the language. He could have dismantled this movement with argument alone, but he never argued. Not once. He arrested instead. When a man capable of winning a debate chooses violence over words, the question isn't about his beliefs. The question is about what he could no longer afford to say out loud, even to himself. There is one moment in the record that almost no one stops at. Paul was present when Stephen was executed. He didn't throw a single stone. He stood at the edge. He held the coats. He watched, and the text notes, quietly, almost without emphasis, that Paul gave his approval, not his orders, not his celebration, his approval. That word is doing something the text never explains. And what it's doing, what it reveals about the interior of a man standing at the edge of an execution he didn't stop, is the only thing that actually matters in this entire story. Because after Stephen died, Paul didn't slow down, he accelerated. That acceleration has a psychological signature, and that signature doesn't point towards certainty. It points towards something far more dangerous, something that, once you recognize it, makes everything Paul ever did before and after Damascus read completely differently. The road to Damascus is not where this story begins. It's where a man finally ran out of room to keep running from what he already knew. What a man runs from tells you more about him than anything he runs toward. And Paul ran hard. The record in Acts is precise about his movements, almost uncomfortably precise. He wasn't simply participating in the persecution, he was constructing it. He went to the high priest himself. He requested the letters himself. He named the destination himself. He organized the authority, the travel, the scope. No one assigned this to him. No one escalated the mission to Damascus. No institutional pressure demanded it. The movement had already scattered from Jerusalem. The immediate threat by any strategic measure was contained. And yet, Paul was already moving north, personally, urgently, with papers in his hand. That detail should stop you. Because it means something in Paul's interior was operating on a timeline that had nothing to do with the external threat. And here is the first thing the record shows that no one has ever stopped to examine properly. Stephen had just been executed. The council had accomplished what it intended. Most of the Pharisees returned to their regular functions. Most of the leadership moved on. The crisis appeared resolved. Paul did not move on. He moved faster. In behavioral psychology, there is a specific pattern that emerges when a person accelerates after an external pressure decreases. It doesn't indicate growing conviction. It indicates something else entirely. It indicates that the internal pressure has now become greater than the external one. And when internal pressure exceeds external pressure in a man like Paul, trained, disciplined, theologically armored, the acceleration isn't strategy, it's avoidance. The question no one has ever asked is this: what had Paul already encountered internally that made slowing down more dangerous than continuing. There is one moment in the record that holds the answer, or at least the first layer of it. Paul was present at Stephen's execution. He didn't participate directly. He stood at the edge. He held the coats. He watched, and while he watched, Stephen spoke. Not a defense, not a plea. Stephen described what he claimed to see. The heavens opened, the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. He said it out loud, in front of the entire council, in front of Paul. Every other man in that room responded immediately. They covered their ears, they rushed him, they dragged him out screaming. Paul stood still. Rage is a clean psychological response. Rage means the information was processed and instantly rejected. Rage means the internal system held its structure. Rage means there was no penetration. Paul didn't rage. Paul watched, and then Paul approved. Those two responses are not the same. They are not even close to the same. And the distance between the man who covers his ears and the man who silently approves, that distance is where this entire investigation lives. Because after that day, Paul never produced a single recorded argument against what Stephen claimed. Not one documented theological rebuttal. Not one public dismantling of the vision. Think about what that means. This is a man trained his entire life to argue, to construct, to dismantle, to defend. He had every instrument, he had the platform, he had the language, and he had nothing to say. Silence in a mind like Paul's is never absence. Silence is where something has already taken root that the mind cannot yet afford to look at directly. So instead of looking at it, Paul moved, he traveled, he accelerated. He kept the mission expanding because expansion meant forward motion, and forward motion meant he never had to stop and face what the silence already contained. But here is what the record reveals next. Something that happened during the persecution, not before it, not after it, that suggests the silence wasn't just passive. It wasn't just avoidance. It was already doing something to him. Quietly, structurally. In a way, Paul himself may not have had a name for yet. And the evidence for it isn't in what Paul did. It's in what Paul stopped being able to do, without apparently noticing he had stopped. What Paul stopped being able to do was argue from the same center. Not visibly. Not in any way anyone around him could detect. The argument still sounded identical from the outside. The credentials were intact. The language was fluent. The mission was still moving. But something beneath the arguments had shifted, and a structure built on a shifting foundation doesn't collapse immediately. It compensates. Compensation is invisible by design. It doesn't announce itself. It quietly redistributes weight, moves urgency here, redirects attention there, reclassifies what counts as a threat, redefines which questions are even worth asking. Paul was compensating, and the pattern is sitting in the record, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to look at it forensically. Every person Paul arrested shared the same profile, not violent, not organized, not politically dangerous, not a military threat, not a legal threat, not a financial threat. They were people making a specific claim, and Paul's entire operation, the letters, the travel, the arrests, the jurisdiction, was designed around one function: silencing that claim, not disproving it, silencing it. Sit with that distinction for a moment, because it is the entire investigation. A man who believes an idea is false argues against it. A man who needs an idea to be false removes the people saying it. Those are not the same response. They don't come from the same place. And Paul, without a single visible moment of decision, had crossed the line between those two responses and never looked back. The question is when, and the question beneath that is why. Because there is a specific mechanism in human psychology that produces exactly this kind of crossing. It doesn't require conscious choice. It doesn't require a moment of moral failure. It only requires one thing: an idea that a person's constructed identity cannot survive being true. When that idea appears, the system doesn't evaluate it. The system quarantines it, and then the system builds walls, not around the idea, but around the capacity to consider it. From the inside, that process doesn't feel like fear. It feels like conviction. The mission feels sharper than ever. The urgency feels completely rational. The acceleration feels like purpose, because the interior structure has already done its work quietly, reclassified the threat, sealed the dangerous questions, and redirected all available energy toward movement. Because movement is the only thing that keeps a man from having to stop and reckon with what his own silence already knows. And Paul kept moving, until something in the final weeks before Damascus began to surface that no amount of movement could suppress. The arrests were no longer producing what they were supposed to produce. The mission was expanding. The scope was increasing. The letters were being signed. The road to Damascus was already planned, and Paul was still not settled. That absence of settlement in a man who had built his entire life around certainty is the most precise diagnostic signal in this entire investigation, because it reveals something about the interior that the exterior was working overtime to hide. The structure wasn't protecting Paul from the movement. The structure was protecting Paul from a single question, one specific, devastating question that everything he had ever done was designed to prevent him from asking. And by the time he reached the road, that question had already formed completely. He just hadn't said it yet. What happens to a man when the last wall he built is the only thing standing between him and the answer he already knows? The last wall doesn't fall from the outside. It fails from the inside, quietly, completely, with no announcement, the moment the person maintaining it runs out of reasons to keep maintaining it. And Paul had been maintaining his, with the only resource still available to him: motion. Not argument, not theology, not certainty, movement. Forward, outward, northward, because a man in motion never has to answer what a man in stillness cannot avoid. But motion has a ceiling, and by the time the letters were signed and the road was chosen, Paul had already reached it. The mission was still expanding externally. The authorization was secured. Every visible marker of continuation was in place, and Paul was running entirely on structure, not conviction. Structure. The difference is the most important forensic detail in this entire investigation. Conviction has a living center, a point of real contact between what a man believes and who a man actually is. Structure has no center. It has only its own weight. It moves because it was built to move. It continues because stopping would require examining why it was built in the first place. Paul had stopped examining, not because the answers had arrived, because the questions had become invisible to him. That is the final stage of every invisible process. Not suppression, not denial, normalization. The point at which an internal conflict no longer registers as conflict. The point at which a man's compensations have become his personality. The point at which the wall no longer feels like a wall. It feels like a foundation. That is what had settled inside Paul before Damascus. Not doubt, not guilt, not crisis. Something far more structurally complete. An entire interior architecture built around a question he had never asked, and had lived inside of so long that the architecture itself felt like identity. Damascus didn't interrupt a man who was certain. It interrupted a man who had finished constructing his certainty, and whose construction was the most precise evidence of everything he had refused to examine. The light didn't change Paul. The light made it impossible for Paul to maintain the interior infrastructure that had been doing the changing for months. Everything collapsed at once, not because something new entered him, but because nothing he had built was ever load-bearing. The road to Damascus was 3 days long. The process that made Damascus inevitable had no measurable beginning. By the time a man falls, he has already been falling for longer than he knew how to see.